There was a woman in the valley who woke before the roosters did. Not because she wanted to, because the cold came through the walls and the children needed tending and the hens needed feeding and there was no one left to divide the morning with. Her name was Nora. She had been a wife once, and before that a daughter, and before that a girl who believed that life arranged itself the way a good field does, with patience and water and the right season. She had learned otherwise, but she had not stopped getting up. She sold eggs. That was the shape of it. Every morning she carried what the hens gave her down to the fence post at the edge of her property, and she waited. And sometimes people came and sometimes they did not, and either way she walked back to the house and fed the children and began the day over again. The town of Harlan Creek had opinions about a widow selling eggs at a fence post. The town of Harlan Creek had opinions about most things. Nora had learned not to listen for them. He came on a Tuesday. That was the first thing anyone would have said about it, if anyone had been watching. A man on a gray horse, arriving in the dark before the sun had cleared the ridge, pulling up at her fence post as if he had always known it was there. He bought every egg she had. He counted out the coins correctly and placed them on the post without touching her hand, and he said very little, and what he said was not remarkable. And yet, Nora stood at that fence for a long moment after he rode away, looking at the coins as though they had asked her a question she did not yet know how to answer. Some stories begin with fire, with floods, with losses so large they take the breath from the room. This one begins with eggs and a man who came back, the next morning, and the morning after that. There is a kind of love that does not announce itself, that moves the way a river moves under ice in January, invisible, persistent, certain of where it is going long before anyone standing on the bank can see it. This is that kind of story. By the time the snow left the valley and the creek began to run again, and the first green appeared along the south-facing slope, something had shifted in Harlan Creek that could not be shifted back. Not the town exactly, not the man, not even the woman, who had always been exactly what she was. What shifted was the space between them, the quiet, ordinary, unremarkable space where, it turns out, the most durable things are built. The first frost came on a Monday that year, earlier than anyone had expected, and by Tuesday morning the ground along the east pasture was hard enough to ring under a boot heel. Nora heard it when she stepped outside before dawn. She stood on the porch and listened to the sound of it, and then she went to the coop and let the hens out and filled the water trough and broke the thin skin of ice that had formed along the edge of the bucket. She did not think about the cold as a problem. She thought about it the way a farmer thinks about weather, as a fact to be worked around, not a complaint to be made. She had 9 hens. She had 2 children. She had 31 acres of land that her husband Caleb had left her when he died of a lung sickness the previous winter, and she had a henhouse with a roof that let in water on the north corner, and she had a woodpile that was smaller than she needed it to be, and she had $4 and some coins in a tin on the kitchen shelf. She did not spend time adding these things up. She already knew what they came to. She had been adding them up since March. The children were 7 and 4. The older one was a girl named Ada, who had her father's eyes and her mother's habit of going quiet when she was thinking hard about something. The younger was a boy named Thomas, who was not yet old enough to be useful, but was old enough to follow Nora around the property asking questions she did not always have answers to. He had taken to asking about the fence post near the road in particular. Why did Mama put the eggs there? Why did she wait? Who was coming? Nora told him people from town sometimes stopped on their way through. Thomas accepted this the way small children accept most explanations. Not fully, but enough to move on to the next question. The fence post was her market. She could not leave the children alone long enough to walk to Harlan Creek proper and set up at the trading post the way some of the other farm women did on Saturdays. So she had built a small shelf onto the post at the edge of her property, where the road turned. And she set out what she had each morning in a cloth-covered basket, and she stood nearby. And she waited. Some mornings, the minister's wife came by in a wagon and bought a half-dozen without getting down from the seat. Some mornings, a family passing through stopped and looked and moved on without buying anything. Some mornings, no one came at all, and Nora carried the eggs back to the house and used them herself, which was not the worst outcome but was not a sustainable one. The town had not been unkind to her. That was the most accurate way to put it. Not unkind. Several women from the church had brought food in the weeks after Caleb died, and the minister had come twice to check on her, and a man named Patterson, who owned land to the north, had sent his hired hand over in April to plow the kitchen garden. These were real things. She had been grateful for them, but there is a difference between kindness offered in the aftermath of a loss and the steady, unremarkable presence of someone who intends to stay. And Nora understood that difference the way a woman understands it who has been on both sides of it. The food was eaten. The plowing was done. The minister moved on to other families with other troubles. And Nora remained, with her 9 hens and her 2 children and her 31 acres and her tin on the shelf. She had heard things, as a matter of course, the way sound travels in a small valley through dry goods counters and church steps and the space between wagons on a Saturday. She had heard what some people said about a widow alone on a working property, that it would not hold, that the land would go to weeds or to debt, that it was a shame about the children. She did not engage with these observations directly. She got up before the roosters, and she fed the hens, and she carried the eggs to the fence post, and she waited. That was her answer, and she made it every morning without ceremony. It was on a Tuesday in the 2nd week of November that the man came. She did not hear the horse until it was already at the fence, which was unusual, because she had good ears and the road was quiet at that hour, and most riders made more noise than they meant to. He pulled up at the post without apparent hurry and sat for a moment looking at the basket before he swung down from the saddle. He was not a young man, and not an old one. He wore a coat that had been good once, and still was, in the way a well-made thing holds its quality past the point where it shows wear. He had the kind of hands that come from outdoor work, wide across the knuckles, careful in their movement, not drawing attention to themselves. He looked at the eggs. He looked at Nora. He said, "How much for the lot?" It was not quite a question. It was the way a man speaks when he already intends to pay regardless of the answer and is only asking as a courtesy. Nora told him. He counted out the coins and set them on the shelf of the post, not in her hand, not with any production. Just set them there and picked up the basket. He said he would bring the basket back in the morning. She said that was fine. "Phew," he said. "Good morning, then." And he remounted and rode south on the road, and Nora stood at the fence post with the coins in her palm and watched the gray horse disappear around the bend in the tree line. She did not tell Ada about it. There was nothing particular to tell. A man had bought her eggs. She went back to the house and made the children their breakfast and put Thomas's boots on for him, because he could not yet manage the laces on the left one, and she swept the porch and began the rest of the day. But that evening, when she was banking the fire for the night and the children were already asleep, she thought about the coins set on the post, not in her hand. There was something in that. She did not examine it too closely. She put the thought away and went to bed. He came back on Wednesday. The basket was on his saddle, washed and dried, the cloth folded neatly inside it. He had the same coat, the same horse. He bought every egg she had and counted out the coins and set them on the post and said very little beyond what the transaction required. On Thursday, he came again. And on Friday. By the end of that first week, Nora had more money in the tin on the shelf than she had accumulated in the 3 weeks before, and Ada had begun to stand at the kitchen window in the gray hour before sunrise, watching the road. Not saying anything, just watching. The way a child watches for something she has decided to believe in but is not yet ready to name out loud. His name was David Crail. She learned this not from him but from Patterson, the man who owned the land to the north, who mentioned it one afternoon in a way that was not quite casual. The way people in small valleys mention things they have been holding for a while and have finally decided to release. Patterson said, David Crail had come down from the timber country 2 years prior, that he had worked a season at the Aldrich Mill and then another at a ranch south of the creek, that he was known to be capable and quiet and to pay what he owed. Patterson did not say anything beyond that. He looked at Nora for a moment after he finished, and then he looked away, and Nora thanked him for the information as though she had merely been asking about the weather. She had not asked. Patterson had offered. That was the difference, and it was not a small one. In a town the size of Harlan Creek, the distance between a question and an answer freely given was the distance between a rumor and a fact, and Nora had learned to be careful about which side of it she stood on. She did not ask about David Crail. She did not mention him to Ada, who had stopped standing at the kitchen window in the mornings and had begun instead to sit on the porch step with her coat on, watching the road with the particular patience of a child who has decided that patience is worth practicing. Nora noticed this and said nothing about it. Some things are not helped by being spoken. It was a Thursday in late November when she first saw him work. She had come out to the fence post earlier than usual because the cold had woken her and she could not go back to sleep. And she found him already there, not on his horse, but standing at the near fence line with his coat off despite the temperature, re-stringing a section of wire that had come loose from its post. He had not asked her. He had not mentioned it the morning before. He had simply arrived with wire and pliers and was doing the thing that needed doing, in the unhurried way of a man who is not working for an audience. Nora stood at the corner of the coop and watched him for a moment. He did not look up. She went back inside and made the children's breakfast. And when she came out again with the egg basket, he was back on his horse and the fence line was whole. She set the basket on the post. He bought the eggs. He counted the coins and placed them where he always placed them, and she said, "You did not have to do that." He looked at her the way a man looks at something he is trying to place, not unkindly, but with a kind of careful attention. He said, "The wire was going." She said, "I know." He nodded once as if that settled the matter and rode south. Nora looked at the fence line for a long moment. The wire was good work. It was better than she would have managed herself with the tools she had, and she knew it. And she did not resent knowing it. That seemed important somehow, that she could look at a thing done well by someone else and be grateful without it costing her anything. The shutter on the east bedroom window had been loose since October. It knocked in the wind at night, and Thomas had begun sleeping with his blanket pulled over his head because of the sound, and Nora had been meaning to fix it and had not had a free hand or a free hour long enough to do so. On a Tuesday in December, she came outside and found David at the side of the house with a hammer and 2 new hinge pins, fitting the shutter back against the frame with the kind of precise, unhurried attention he seemed to bring to every physical task. He worked from the bottom up. He tested each hinge before he moved to the next one. He did not whistle or talk to himself. He simply worked, the way a man works when the work itself is enough company. Thomas came out while he was doing it. Nora watched from the porch, ready to call the boy back. But David did not seem to mind the company. Thomas stood beside him and watched, and after a while David handed him the hammer and pointed to a nail that needed setting, and Thomas drove it in with 4 strikes, 2 of them reasonably true, and David examined it without comment and moved on to the next task. Thomas came back to the porch with his chest arranged in a particular way that Nora recognized as pride being carefully managed by a 4-year-old who did not yet have a word for it. She did not say anything to him. She put her hand briefly on the top of his head and went inside. The town noticed. Of course it did. Harlan Creek was not a place where a man could mend a widow's fence and shudder without the fact of it finding its way to the dry goods counter before the week was out. Martha Elling was the one who said it plainest. The way Martha Elling always was the one to say things plainest. She said it was an interesting situation, a man appearing out of nowhere to do work on a woman's property without any formal arrangement that anyone knew of. She said she hoped Nora understood what people would think. She said this to two women at the counter on a Wednesday morning, and the words moved outward from there in the way words do in a small valley, multiplying and softening and hardening by turns until they reached the shape of a thing much larger than what was originally said. Nora heard about it from the minister's wife, who told her with a look of sincere concern that Nora received with a look of sincere thanks, and then set aside entirely. She was not unaware of how things appeared. She was not naive about the calculations a town makes about a woman alone. But there was nothing between her and David Crail that required defending, and she was not willing to begin treating innocent things as though they needed justification. He bought her eggs. He had mended her fence and her shutter. He had handed her son a hammer. These were facts. They were not a story, and she refused to make them into one before they were ready. Ada was the one who said his name out loud first. Not as a question, not with any weight attached to it, just as a piece of information offered at the supper table on a Friday evening, the way children offer things they have been holding and have decided it is finally time to put down. She said, "David's horse has a white left foot." She put another spoonful of beans in her mouth and looked at her plate. Thomas looked at his sister with great interest, then at his mother. Nora poured more molasses on her bread and said, "I noticed that." Ada nodded, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. The fire popped once in the stove. Thomas returned to his beans. The subject was closed without having been opened, and yet something in the room was different after it, in the way a room is different after a window is raised on the first warm day of spring. The same room, the same furniture, but different air moving through it. January came the way it always came to that valley, without apology and without hurry, settling into the hollows and along the creek bed and against the north face of every structure that had not been built with January in mind. Nora's house had not been built with January in mind. Caleb had meant to add insulation to the north wall the winter before he got sick, and then he was sick. And then he was gone. And the wall remained as it had always been, and Nora stuffed rags into the worst of the gaps and hung a second blanket over the children's window and kept the stove fed through the night the way a person tends something they cannot afford to let go out. She slept in her clothes most nights. She did not tell anyone this. The Valley Road closed on a Wednesday in the second week of January, after 3 days of snow that came sideways off the ridge and filled the cuts and the low places until the road was indistinguishable from the fields on either side of it. Nora had seen it close before. She knew what it meant. No one in, no one out. No market. No mail. No contact with the town of Harlan Creek until the temperature lifted and the snow settled enough to pass. She had laid in what she could. Flour and salt and dried beans and a side of salt pork from the cellar and lamp oil enough for 6 weeks if she was careful. She had been careful all her life. She was not afraid of 3 weeks. What she had not laid in, and could not have, was certainty about the note. Harlan Peck held a lien against her property, a debt Caleb had taken on the previous spring for seed and fencing, and 2 items Nora could no longer remember, recorded on a paper she had read carefully and signed because there was no other option. The note came due on the 15th of February. She had been calculating toward it since autumn, moving money from one side of the ledger to the other in her head each night before sleep, and she had not found a way to make the numbers come out right. The eggs helped. The eggs had helped more than she expected, but they were not enough. And she knew it. And she had been carrying that knowledge the way a person carries something heavy that they have decided not to set down in front of anyone else. Peck came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into the closure, the day after the first thaw made the road passable again. He came in a buggy with the hood up against the remaining cold, and he tied his horse at the gate and came up the path to the door with his hat on and his hands in his coat pockets. He was not a large man, but he had a way of taking up space that had nothing to do with size, the way some men do who have spent a long time being owed things. Nora opened the door before he knocked because she had heard the buggy on the road, and she knew whose it was. She stood in the doorway and did not invite him in. He said he wanted to talk about the note. She said she was aware of the note. He said February 15th was coming up fast and he wanted to know her intentions, and then he paused in the particular way of a man who has prepared what comes next and is making sure there is enough silence before it to give it the right weight. He said there were arrangements that could be made. He said a property like this, managed right, could be quite productive. He said he was a reasonable man and that he had always thought well of her situation and that there were ways to settle a debt that did not always involve cash money. He said all of this looking at a point somewhere past her left shoulder, not at her face. Nora did not move from the doorway. She had heard language like this before, not directed at her, but at other women, in other circumstances. And she understood its shape the way you understand the shape of a thing you have been warned about. She did not respond to what he had said. She looked at him steadily, the way a woman looks at something she is not going to accept, but is not going to argue with either, because arguing gives it more room than it deserves. She became aware then that there was someone standing at the corner of the house. She had not heard David arrive. She did not know how long he had been there. He was not moving toward them, and he was not speaking. He was simply standing at the corner of the house the way a man stands when he has arrived somewhere and is waiting to understand what is needed. His coat was on. His hat was in his hand. He looked at Peck with an expression that was not anger and not a warning, exactly, but was something that occupied the same territory as both, in the quiet way of a man who does not need to raise his voice to be understood. Peck saw him. Something shifted in his posture. Not quickly, not dramatically, but in the way a man shifts when the calculation he came in with no longer adds up the way it did. He looked back at Nora, and then at David, and then at his own boots for a moment. David came forward then, not fast, not slow, the way a man moves when he is not asking for anything. He reached into his coat and took out a money belt, and from it he counted bills and coins onto Nora's porch railing, the full amount of the note, which he appeared to know without being told, plus a month's interest, which he added without comment. He picked up the receipt from Peck's coat pocket. Peck did not resist this, and signed it and handed it to Nora and put the copy back where it had come from. He said to Peck, "I think you have what you need." It was not a question. Peck said nothing. He went back down the path to his buggy and untied his horse and left without looking back, and the sound of the wheels on the thawing road faded south toward town. Nora stood on the porch holding the receipt. She looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at David, who had put his hat back on and was standing at the bottom of the porch steps as though waiting to see if there was anything else that needed doing. She said, "You did not have to do that." He said, "The note was wrong." She said, "It was a legal note." He said, "I know what it was." There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. Some silences are not. Thomas appeared in the doorway behind Nora, drawn by the sound of the buggy leaving. He looked at his mother and then at David, and then at the porch railing where the money had been and was no longer. He said, "David." Not as a greeting exactly, more the way a child says a name when they are confirming something to themselves, making a thing real by putting a word to it. David looked at the boy. The corner of his mouth moved just slightly. He said, "Thomas." Then he said supper was getting cold somewhere and he ought to get back to it. Thomas considered this seriously, then nodded and went inside. Nora held the door for a moment. She said, "Come and eat." It was the first time she had said it. David came up the steps and she held the door and he went inside, and she followed him, and the door closed against the January cold, and the fire in the stove was burning well. February passed the way February passes in a hard valley, slowly, and then all at once. There were 2 more storms after the thaw, smaller ones, the kind that come as a last argument from a season that knows it is losing. Nora banked the fire each night and rose before the children and went to the coop and broke the ice in the water trough and did all the things she had always done. Except that now David came most mornings and sometimes stayed past the egg transaction to split wood or check the coop roof or sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee while Thomas showed him things. A carved button, a piece of quartz he had found near the creek, a drawing Ada had made of the gray horse that was not entirely accurate but was recognizable. David looked at each thing with the same steady attention he gave to fence wire and hinge pins. He did not perform interest. He simply had it. He did not speak about the money. He did not refer to Peck or the note or the evening he had come inside and eaten supper at their table for the first time. He behaved as though these things had happened in the ordinary course of events, which Nora was beginning to understand, was how David Crail treated most things, not by diminishing them, but by placing them where they belonged and moving forward. She found she was grateful for this in a way she could not have explained to anyone who had not needed it. Some people make a gift feel like a debt. He did not do that. He made it feel like weather, a thing that had come and passed and left the ground changed, and that was all. The creek broke on a Thursday in the first week of March. Nora heard it from the kitchen, a sound like something shifting deep in the ground, and then the particular rushing that meant the ice had given way and the water was moving again. Ada heard it too and came to the window, and they stood together looking out at nothing visible from that distance, but knowing what the sound meant. Thomas slept through it. Nora put her hand on Ada's shoulder for a moment, and Ada leaned into her very slightly. And they stood like that until the sound settled into a steady run and became background, the way water always does when you stop listening for it and it becomes part of the air. David came the next morning on a Friday and bought the eggs and set the coins on the post, and then he said, without particular preamble, "I would like to show you something, if you have time." Nora looked at him. She said Ada could watch Thomas for an hour. He waited at the fence while she went inside and told Ada, and Ada received this information with the careful expressionlessness of a 7-year-old who has thoughts she is choosing not to share. And Nora put on her coat and her good boots and went back out to the road. They walked east along the creek path. He did not explain where they were going, and she did not ask. The morning was cold still, but different, the cold of a season ending rather than a season holding. The kind of air that has some give in it, that smells faintly of mud and bark and moving water. The pines along the south slope still held snow in their upper branches, but the ground beneath them was clear, and somewhere in the tree line a bird was making a sound it had not made since October. Nora walked beside David, and they did not talk much, and what they said was about the path, a muddy section, a place where the creek had come over the bank and left silt on the grass. Not over the silence, beside it. The land opened after a bend in the path. 40 acres of bottomland, south-facing, with good grass already showing green along the low places where the snowmelt had run through. There was a house set back from the tree line, not large but solid, built of good timber with a stone foundation and a covered porch that ran the length of the front face and looked out over the pasture and the creek below. There were new boards on one section of the porch where old ones had been replaced. The roof was whole. The windows were whole. There was a barn behind the house, smaller than a working ranch would want, but sufficient, with a corral of new posts and good wire. Nora stood at the edge of the property and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. David stood beside her. He said he had owned it for 2 years. He said he had been working on it as he had time, which had not always been regular time, but that the foundation was sound and the roof had been redone in the fall and the well was good. He said it the way a man presents something he has spent a long time on and is not sure how to offer. Plainly, without ornament, trusting the thing itself to speak. He looked at the house and nodded her while he said it. Then he looked at her. He said, "I would like you to have it. You and Ada and Thomas, if you are willing." He paused. He said, "I am asking you to marry me. I want to say that plainly so there is no confusion about what I mean." Nora looked at the house. She looked at the porch with its new boards and the pasture with its early green, and the creek running below it, visible now as a bright line through the bare willows. She thought about the tin on the shelf, and the rags in the wall gaps, and the sound the shutter had made before he fixed it. And she thought about Thomas driving a nail with a hammer at the age of 4, and Ada drawing a horse that was recognizable if not accurate. And she thought about supper, and the fire, and the coins placed always on the post and never in her hand. There are things you know before you know them. There are things that have already been decided by the time you are asked. She said, "Yes." She did not say it quietly, and she did not say it with any performance of deliberation. She said it the way she said most things, plainly, having already done the thinking. David looked at her for a moment in the way a man looks at something he has been hoping for, but has not allowed himself to count on. And then he looked back at the house and something in his face settled, the way a thing settles when it is finally where it belongs. He said, "Good." She said, "The porch boards are good work." He said, "They ought to last." They stood together looking at the property for a while longer in the March morning, and the creek ran, and the bird in the tree line went on with whatever it had been saying. The town of Harlan Creek made its adjustments in the way small towns make adjustments. Not quickly, and not with any announcement, but steadily, and in the end, completely. Martha Elling said very little after the wedding, which was held on a Tuesday at the minister's house with the children present and Patterson as witness. What she did say was not unkind, which was as close to a concession as anyone who knew Martha Elling would have expected, and it was enough. The minister's wife brought a honey cake. Patterson shook David's hand and kissed Nora on the cheek, and told Thomas that the nail he had driven was still holding, which Thomas received as the high compliment it was. And that was the story of Nora and David Crail, a woman who carried her ledger in her head through the longest winter of her life and never once let the numbers make her small, and a man who bought eggs because he needed to be near something worth being near and spent 2 years building a place for it before he said a word. The fire burned in the house with the sound foundation and the new porch boards. The gray horse stood in the good corral. The creek ran the way it runs every spring, certain and unhurried, past the roots of the willows and into the open country below. The way water goes when the ice has finally had enough, and the season turns and everything that was waiting begins, quietly and without ceremony, to move. Let me know in the comments how this one felt. I hope it found you well. See you in the next one.